On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, it's day 3 of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's time for Ukraine to adopt a new maritime strategy: privateers. Welcome to this episode of What's Going On with Shipping. So, day 3 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and of course, we've seen just horrific images coming out on media, social media, and from people there. The effort by the Ukrainians to defend their country is absolutely impressive. However, one of the things that we're seeing is the overwhelming superiority, or not really superiority, I should say, but really just the ability of the Russians to bring this war against the Ukrainians on multiple fronts, in particularly the naval front. And one of the things we're starting to see is the use of Russian naval forces much more in the prosecution of their strategy, including potential amphibious assaults along the southern coast of Ukraine. And today I want to propose to Ukraine a alternative maritime strategy: privateers. But before we get into that, if you're new to the channel and you haven't seen us before, please take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so be alerted about new videos when they come out, leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, become a Patreon. Support the channel so that we can keep bringing you maritime information like this. So let's go in, recap what's going on right now in day 3, and then talk about this potential new maritime strategy for Ukraine. So this is Marine Traffic. Hats off to Georgios and the crew at Marine Traffic. They've been doing stellar work, keeping up with everything that's been unfolding here. This is the map right here of the Black Sea, and a couple of things stand out as you look at the Black Sea map, and we'll zoom in just a little bit here. This area right here in the north, this is the Azov Sea, Sea of Azov. You can name different things. You'll see it almost completely empty of shipping. Now, note, Navy vessels have AIS transponders, but unlike military aircraft, which have to squawk it all the time, vessels don't. As a matter of fact, commercial vessels can go dark. Literally, you just pull the plug, turn it off. And that's what's going on right now. So we don't see Russian naval vessels here, but we have word of amphibious assaults here along the coast west of Mariupol. This is the Ukrainian-Russian border. Rostov-on-Don is a Russian port. This is the Kerch Strait. This is where that huge backlog of ships has resided. You can see all the vessels trying to get in there, other vessels being turned around. This is the port of Novovesk down to the south. This is a Russian oil terminal. And we know that Russian vessels and tankers are streaming out of there. The other area we know is up here at the port of Odessa. Odessa, this is where some of these vessels have been hit recently. We know there are vessels in here that have been hit. There have been at least 3 vessels hit as reported, but the port of Odessa right here is sitting there with all the ports closed and reports of attacks on the ports. Meanwhile, vessels are heading to the south, hugging along the Romanian-Bulgarian coast for defense and along the Turkish coast. Meanwhile, you see the pileup of ships at here off the Bosphorus, just coming into anchor, waiting to clear the harbor or clear the channel or go up into port. So a real mess right now in the Black Sea, most definitely. Let's go to some of the reports here. This is from USNI News. This is an update on a report they've posted the other day. Russian Navy launches amphibious assault on Ukraine, naval infantry moving toward Mariupol. So we're seeing the use of amphibious forces. The Russians had brought their Baltic fleet down from the Baltic through the Atlantic, the Mediterranean, through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles into the Black Sea. And now they're using it as support. We also know the Russians are using naval forces for shore bombardment, for attacks. The bulk of the Russian fleet is sitting in the Mediterranean right now, but here's a recap of Russian naval activity. This is from H.I. Sutton he does a great job at Covert Shores on Twitter. He's talking about the amphibious assaults here west of Mariupol, talking here about the attack on Snake Island, the reported attack that slaughtered the crew there of Ukrainians. And then we know of 3 attacks on vessels: the Yasser Jupiter, a Turkish bulk carrier flying the Marshall Islands flag, Namora Queen, a Japanese bulk carrier, and Millennial Spirit, chemical tanker flying Moldavian owned. And so we've seen attacks by the Russians against commercial shippings in the Black Sea, ships that are not Ukrainian. Let's be clear. Yasa Jupiter, Namora Queen, Millennial Spirit are not Ukrainian vessels, yet they've been attacked, hit. Fortunately, as far as we know, no crew have been lost. Again, we know the Russian Navy is stationed here in the Eastern Mediterranean right now, off the base of Taurus in Syria. At least two Slava-class cruisers are there, along with 2 Kilo-class submarines are right now in that harbor. Numerous reports had come in. A lot of these were putting out by the president of Ukraine, asking for the Turks to close the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus to Turkish vessels. And there's been a lot of back and forth on this, reports that the straits have closed, that they haven't been closed. This is the most recent. John Conrad over at G Captain, who was on with me the other day on day one, talked about this. Turkey did not close the Bosphorus to Russian ships. Got reports from the Turks that the straits are open. So we're seeing multiple issues on attacks in the Black Sea launched by the Russians against Ukrainians and against commercial vessels. And again, I have this view that, listen, commercial vessels are being hit. Turkey is a NATO ally. Japan is an ally of the United States and many nations there. Yet we know that the only NATO presence right now in the Black Sea is the Bulgarians, the Romanians, and the Turks. There's no presence by any other NATO nations in the Black Sea to provide protection, escort for neutral or NATO vessels out of the area. And again, I've gotten in quite a bit of discussions with naval personnel about this. We know that the NATO force is in the Mediterranean, at least 3 carriers, the Truman Battle Group, excuse me, 4 American destroyers that were sent from Norfolk several weeks ago. There's 4 U.S. destroyers based in Rota for ballistic missile defense. The Italian carrier Cavour flying F-35s, and the French carrier Charles de Gaulle is all in the Mediterranean right now. However, the Ukrainians have suffered greatly at this. When they lost Sevastopol, they lost a good chunk of their navy, and what's left of their navy, we're not sure is even operating anymore if it hasn't been sunk already or blockaded into port, unable to come out to deal with the Russian naval threat. So what actions have been taken against Russia, specifically against Russian ships? So let's take a look at that and discuss it. So stories from Lloyd's List came out here. U.S. sanctions 5 Russian ships in response to invasion of Ukraine. Treasury Office of Foreign Assets Control has imposed sanctions on vessels that are owned by the firm PSB Leasing 000. So we know 5 ships. These include the Baltic Leader, Linda, Pegasus, Magadon, and Manaron have been issued with basically sanctions. And with those sanctions, by the way, action has been taken. This story right here, France arrests Russian heavy lift ship owned by sanctioned oligarch. This is the Baltic Leader, one of those 5 ships that was seized by the French. French Sea Police seized the ship on Saturday that authorities suspected belonged to a Russian company targeted by European Union sanctions over the war in Ukraine, a government official told Reuters. The vessel transporting cars was headed for St. Petersburg, is strongly suspected of being linked to Russian interests targeted by sanctions. The ship was diverted to the port of Bologna in northern France between 3 and 4 a.m. So we're seeing the arrest of vessels already, but not all vessels of the Russian fleet. This story by Lloyd: shipping shuns Russia's risk as sanctions fuel rocketing rates. Insurers are seeking legal clarity over Russian risk, but shipping businesses are deciding to steer clear of any exposure to Russian entities as war risk premiums in excess of $300,000 for some voyages and the promise of transaction trouble to come all prove too much. The threat of sanctions is raising the cost for vessels to haul cargo for the Russian fleet. So these are imposing risks on the Russians. So we're seeing it more expensive to ship cargo on Russian vessels. So a story from Lloyd's: facing both ways on Russian shipping sanctions. If restrictions are to be imposed on Russian shipping, the obvious question is what to do with Samkavflot, the world's largest tanker operator by fleet size. The Russian fleet, the Sovcom fleet, which is a state-owned fleet, is a massive entity for Russia. You get this follow-up story here on Lloyd's List. Sovcom fleet hit by U.S. financial restrictions as Ukraine crisis escalates. U.S. entities are banned from dealing with new debts or shares to be issued by Russian largest shipping firms. Now, again, this is just U.S. entities cannot interact with Sovcom fleet. And Sovcom fleet, again, it is a big entity. This is them right here. This is their main page. And of course, I will have this on the show notes so that you can take a look at this. So as this says here on their page, they're one of the world's largest energy companies specializing in transportation of crude oil, petroleum products, and liquefied gas, as well as the servicing of offshore oil and gas production. The group's fleet comprises 133 vessels with a combined dead weight of 11 million tons, with the average age of 12.4 years. More than 80 vessels have ice class. This is a modern fleet being built largely by the Koreans for the Russians. And so Sovcom fleet is really the financial maritime arm of the Russians. And what we're seeing right now is those vessels are still operating largely unimpeded right now. Right here, the story was from the other day from Sam Chambers, but I think it still is a pertinent one. UN urges for safe passage across the Black Sea in wake of merchant ship attacks. The head of the UN shipping agency has called for safe passage of merchant ships in the wake of 3 vessel strikes in the opening days. Ki-Tak Lim, the Secretary General of the International Maritime Organization, said yesterday, quote, "The security situation in the Ukraine is impacting trade by sea. The safety of marine personnel, including seafarers, is vital. Shipping is essential to global trade. As has been proven during the course of the COVID-19 pandemic, I urge all parties to take steps to ensure the protection of seafarers, vessels, and cargoes." And it goes in here to talk about this. It also goes on to say, insurance rates have leapt for ships heading into the area, with Reuters suggesting an additional war risk insurance cover for 7 days has been quoted at anywhere up to 5% of insurance costs. The usual cost for insurance of a vessel, 0.025% in the Black Sea. So this is a substantial rise in the cost to operate a vessel, with insurance and operating costs spiking at this time. And then you have this story we talked about the other day with Black Sea insurance rates soaring. This just goes to confirm that. All right. That then brings us to the issue that I want to focus in on. What can Ukraine do to counter the Russian naval attack along their southern shore? What kind of naval maritime strategy is possible for Ukraine? And the option I came up with, and the one I would put forward to the Ukrainians, is it's time to go privateering. Now, I'm a graduate of the State University of New York Maritime College, where our school's mascot was privateers. That was the name of our team. We were the privateers. I then went to get my master's at East Carolina University, where theirs is the pirate. So I know quite well the difference between pirates and privateers, let alone that I am a merchant mariner and a maritime historian. So pirates are entities that operate without state control. They basically have no state representation, hence the black flag. Privateers are licensed private men of war that can be used by nation states to attack enemy commerce on the high seas in the name of that nation. And while Ukraine can't operate their navy in the Black Sea because of Russian naval and air dominance over the Black Sea, the Russian fleet on the high seas is exposed and vulnerable to attack by potential privateers licensed by the nation of Ukraine. Let's go into this story and break it down. Now, under U.S. law and U.S. history, we have used privateers quite a bit. If you go into the United States Constitution, for example, there is a specific provision under Article 1, the power given to the legislative branch to authorize privateers. Specifically, what a letter of marque is, this comes from Cornell Law School's site, a license giving authority to a private citizen, allowing the citizen to engage in reprisals against citizens or vessels of another nation. Within the United States, it's the exclusive power is granted to Congress pursuant to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, I'm not talking about the U.S. issuing letters of marque. That's not what I'm talking about. But what I'm saying is, in the U.S. Constitution, there is that ability to do that. And in the past, we have used it. For example, during the American Revolution, privateers were well outnumbered the Continental Navy. This is from a site, www.usmm.org. This is Merchant Marine at War. You'll see right here a comparison of the Navy versus privateers in the Revolutionary War. While the Continental Navy had 64 ships, there were over 1,600 ships that were privateers. And in terms of vessels captured, nearly 10 times the amount of vessels were captured by privateers versus that of the Continental Navy. And this continued on into the War of 1812, where we saw 517 privateers versus 23 U.S. naval vessels. And while privateers weren't as successful in the War of 1812, capturing maybe about 5 times, 6 times as much as U.S. Navy vessels, they were still very successful. And understand, the concept of privateering has not gone away. This was a recent story in 2020 in the U.S. Naval Institute proceedings on this subject. U.S. privateering is legal. This is Brandon Schwartz talking about this. It followed up on an earlier article, Unleash the Privateers, which is arguing about using U.S. privateers in a potential conflict with China to go after their vessels, hence the image here of a Costco shipping vessel. Now, there are private entities out there that do quote unquote wage war, but in different ways. So for example, Sea Shepherd. This was an article written by Claude Berbe, naval historian, political scientist, teaches at the U.S. Naval Academy. He's the director of the U.S. Naval Academy Museum, wrote this piece in 2021 for the Naval War College. Sea Shepherd, the evolution of an eco-vigilante to legitimized maritime capacity builder. This is talking about how Sea Shepherd, the entity that was featured in whale wars on Animal Planet for many years, has really evolved from an eco-vigilante into a entity that is basically hired by nations to enforce fishing laws for them. And so they're executing laws largely within the territorial and economic exclusion zones of nations. So we see versions of this being done. But let's go directly into the issue of privateers. This is an article written in the William and Lee University Law Review by William Young that talks about, how legal it would be for the U.S., for example, to do privateering. A check on faint-hearted presidents, letters of marque and reprisals, since this resides within the power of the legislature versus the president. This is an argument for how Congress can wage war. So again, there are precedents for this. Now, understand within history, privateering has been basically focused as going away. In 1856, the Declaration of Paris meant to outlaw the use of privateers. However, the United States was not a signatory to that. It was codified in the Hague Convention of 1907, neither of which, by the way, were signed by Ukraine, since Ukraine doesn't become an independent nation here until 1991. So Ukraine is not a signatory to it. Russia is, but not Ukraine. So the issue about using privateers is possible. What about under current law? Let's look at the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. What does UNCLOS have to say about privateering? So UN Convention Law of the Sea, UNCLOS, was a treaty ratified in 1982 by nearly every maritime nation on the planet, except for one, the United States. But Ukraine is one. Well, Ukraine isn't actually, but Ukraine later signs it, and Russia has signed it. But in this case, one of the things we see right here is what is the definition of warships? So UNCLOS in Article 29 defines warships as a ship belonging to the armed forces of a state bearing the external marks distinguishing such ships of its nationality under the command of an officer duly commissioned by the government of the state and whose name appears in the appropriate service list or its equivalent and manned by a crew which is under regular armed force discipline. Now, under that definition, a vessel that is operating as a privateer would have to be conformed to that definitions. We're already seeing the Ukrainians bringing in citizen soldiers right now, volunteers. And so this would be a kind of offshoot of that. You would see these vessels brought in maybe under a different designation of the Ukrainian Navy, perhaps similar to the Chinese naval militia that's out there. These vessels can be brought in as private men of war, commissioned into Ukrainian service, and meeting the requirements as defined by Article 29. Now, the provision they have to avoid is Article 101. So most people are unaware what Article 101 says of UNCLAUS, but I don't have a life, so I read UNCLAUS, and basically what it does is defines piracy. So piracy consists under the UNCLAUS of the following acts. So right here, any illegal acts of violence or detention or any act of depredation committed for private ends by the crew or the passengers of a private ship or private aircraft, and directed on the high seas against ship or aircraft or against persons or properties on board ships or aircraft, against a ship, aircraft, persons, or property in a place outside the jurisdiction of any state. So basically the high seas, outside the 12-mile authorized limits set by UNCLAUS. Also, any act of voluntary participation in the operation of a ship or of an aircraft with knowledge of facts making it a pirate ship or aircraft, any act of inciting or of intentionally facilitating an act described in subparagraph A or B. So as long as you're not doing it for private means, and again, you can be contracted by the Ukrainian government to do this. I mean, we use civilian contractors all the time. 1/5 of the US Navy is manned by merchant mariners on government-owned vessels. And then the US government charters vessels for their use and give them basically sovereign immunity. They make them ships of the US government by extending that sovereign immunity to them. And so Ukraine can do this. Ukrainian embassies can open up their doors to individuals and corporations who are seeking letters of marques and reprisals to wage war against Russian Federation vessels in international waters. Now, it has to be international waters. You can't do this in the confines of national waters, which I would argue is great, because what this may do is force Russian vessels to seek refuge off the high seas, economically hurting Ukraine. Let's look at this a little bit more. This is from the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development for their review of marine transportation. They do maritime profiles of every nation. This is the profile for the Russian Federation. And what you see here is the size of their national fleet in thousands of deadweight tons, the number of ships, over 2,800 ships under their national flags, number of seafarers. Russian seafarers make up almost 10% of the world's fleet out there. They're one of the single largest groups out there sailing vessels. And then you can see the statistics here on vessels owned, trade done by Russian vessels around the world. If you look at the review of maritime transport, for example, one of the things we see here is where Russia Federation falls. So if you look at the top 25 ship owning economies of the world, the Russian Federation is number 20 in terms of ship owning economies as of January 1st, 2021. If you look at ownership of world fleet, the Russian Federation ranks 21st in the world. And if you go to flags of registry, the Russian Federation ranks as 24. I'm going to take you over to a site and show you where Russian vessels are on the high seas. Normally for a platform to use for identifying ships, I use Fleet Marine Traffic, but today I'm going to use FleetMon because they have a feature on here that allows you to highlight just registries of vessels, and it's free. This is Russian Federation vessels on the high seas right now, squawking AIS around the world. See them here in the Caspian Sea, in the Black Sea, throughout the Mediterranean, along the northern coast of Europe, up here in the Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea, and more importantly, here in the Pacific along. So green dots represent cargo ships, red dots represent tankers, and all those purple dots represent fishing vessels. If Ukraine was to issue letters of marque and reprisals, and now all of a sudden these vessels become targets, this will mean that these vessels will have to either be escorted, which means the Russian Navy is going to have to come out and do patrolling to prevent this from happening, or it would mean these vessels would have to seek refuge in ports, taking them out of service, thereby hurting the Russian economy. Now, I realize that this has the potential to get absolutely nasty very quickly. And I don't like talking about this. I really don't. I'm one who always talks about merchant shipping and defending merchant mariners. And I don't mean to target Russian merchant mariners, but let's be clear. The Russian government is targeting Ukrainian civilians right now. We know Ukrainian civilians are being killed. We know innocent vessels are being targeted by the Russians. And I think just the threat of issuing letters of marques and reprisals, we're already seeing US sanctions and UN sanctions hurting the Russians by pulling ships like the Baltic Trader off by the French, impact on Sovcomflot and their other shipping firms. But again, one of the things that has happened in the past is national governments, national maritime strategies, naval strategies have adopted this in the past. And now, the Russian Federation merchant fleet becomes a legitimate target because they have targeted Ukrainian vessels, they've targeted Ukraine itself, and they've targeted neutral vessels and have hit neutral vessels. And this could be a legitimate way for Ukraine to leverage force against the Russians on the high seas, forcing their merchant fleet, their fishing fleet, their offshore support vessels for oil to seek refuge and force them to spread assets around. I don't take this lightly. And let me be clear, I really don't. This should not be advocated by someone like me, but I am pretty sure someone somewhere is thinking about this. And this has the potential to go. Now, are there legal and military pitfalls to this? Sure. I'm sure people are going to be screaming, yelling, you're wrong on this, you're wrong on that. And maybe so. Go ahead. Let's start the discussion. I never say I'm 100% right. Anyone who ever tells you they're 100% right is 100% wrong. So just be aware of that. But again, here's an idea. Here's a strategy. This would cause the Russians hesitation if they think the war is going to expand beyond Ukraine. Remember, the war isn't touching Russia at all right now. This is purely within Ukraine. Yeah, there's a couple artillery shells thrown over the border into Russia and Belarus, but largely Russia is on the offense and Ukraine is on the defense right here. This has the potential for Ukraine to go on the offense and open the seas up for their use. We've seen this happen in the past. This sounds like something out of the 18th, 19th century. But you know what? Things have changed. Global trade has changed. And you have to adapt to world situations. There are used warships out there that can be obtained by the Ukrainians. Ships can be donated. It doesn't take much to turn a yacht into a vessel with weaponry on board that can basically stop a vessel on the high seas. Shoulder-mounted weapons, crew-served weapons can be put on board. And again, this will require vessels. Now, there has to be arrangements made with host countries to bring these vessels into port. How do you go about paying the crews for becoming privateers? In the past, they get a portion of the sale of the vessel after it's captured and sold at auction, and portions of the cargo. That would have to be ironed out. There's a whole batch of legal issues here that are out there. But again, Ukraine is desperate right now. They're under attack, and the potential is for that country to fall. And they have to adapt pretty radical ideas to defend themselves. They're fighting for their lives. And a Ukrainian naval strategy that embraces privateering may be a course of action open for them. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I'm sure you found it entertaining and maybe just a bit disturbing. But if you did, please subscribe, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos. Leave a comment. Oh, I'm going to get comments. Pretty sure going to have some good comments in here. Give it a thumbs up. Probably lots of thumbs downs on this one. I'm sure the Russian bots out there and those of you who are working for the Russian government will fill the chat box with a lot of comments. If you can, support me through Patreon. And if you can too, there are many of agencies that are collecting. Actually, you know what? Forget me. Don't even worry about me. I'm good. I don't need your Patreon. Go out and give some money to Ukrainian relief agencies to help them. I'm fine. I'm really fine. I've got a nice house, got a nice job. I'm good. Go ahead, help the Ukrainians as much as you can. And I'd much rather you do that than help me. So until our next video, and here's thoughts with everybody fighting in this conflict. Sal, signing off.